Will be, I guess we do need the microphone. But Kathleen will be telling us about how to manage not your PhD, but your life and your PhD at the same time. And maybe into the future as well.
Right. Can everybody hear me? Okay, first thing I'd like to ask you to do is stand up. We've been sitting for quite a while and listening. Stand up, arms up, wiggle a little bit. Okay, good. Now we can sit down. Right. So the first thing I want to do is just tell you a little bit about who I am, so you can take with a grain of salt what I have to say. So my path was a little bit unusual. I got married in 1990 as an undergraduate, which was super uncommon when I was an undergraduate too. And then I started a PhD program at Stanford in 1991, and my daughter, who was a little tiny person there, was born in 1992 when I was a first-year PhD student. So I did the bulk of my PhD, well, all of my PhDs, I was either pregnant or had a small child. And then I had fully intended to become a professor, but the job market in computer science was actually really bad when I graduated. It was really hard to get a job as a professor, which seems shocking from the current perspective, but was in fact true. So instead of going into academia, I went into industry and worked at a research lab for 15 years. And then when my daughter went to college, she eventually graduated from college, I took the opportunity to transition into academia. I became a professor at Tufts, and along the way went to DARPA for 3 years as a program manager. And after being at Tufts for 2 years, I became the department chair. So I've worked in industry, in academia, and in government. So this is this is a snapshot of my CV, and it's, when you're looking at people's CVs, what you see there is like, wow, they're really impressive. I could never do that. But what you don't see on the CV is there's lots of bumps along the way that they don't get recorded. So I just wanted to tell you like a few of the bumps that are not recorded here. The first was that the job market was really awful when I graduated, so I didn't get to go do a professor position right away. Instead, I went into academia. Another bump was that the group at AT&T that hired me, they had this vision that they were going to start a research lab, a big project in programming languages for networks, and they were going to have like a whole soup to nuts group in programming languages from theory to implementation to applications. And they hired me as kind of the first hire in that effort to do the theory piece. And then the management of that group went to Lucent instead of AT&T. So by the time I actually arrived at my job, the whole project had been scrapped and none of the hiring managers were there. In fact, my boss didn't understand why programming language theory was at all valuable. So not really recommended to show up at a job to have no advocate above you. So I realized that this was a problem and started to work pretty quickly on changing my area of research. So I still got to do programming languages, which is what I really wanted to do. But instead of working on the theory side, I worked on domain-specific languages, the applied side, where I could have relatively immediate impact on AT&T so that they could see like, oh yeah, okay, this is why it's good for us to have Kathleen here. And the consequence of that was like my performance evaluations for the first couple of years at AT&T were like the below expectations, right? Which is not really what you want in your first job. So I worked really hard on a project that had immediate application to AT&T with a senior colleague. And we had the frustrating experience that within AT&T, my senior colleague got all the credit. So AT&T thought basically I was like an advanced grad student or postdoc basically doing what my colleague said I should be doing. Outside of AT&T, I got all the credit, and my senior colleague was completely invisible. And this was despite both of us trying really, really hard to give credit to the other person. Then my senior colleague left and went to become a professor somewhere else, and I started a new project that AT&T was like, oh wait, this is really valuable too, and couldn't have been senior colleague because senior colleague is somewhere else. So immediately, everything switched, and I went from having low performance evaluations to very high performance evaluations. They can only give a certain number of people the highest performance evaluation. So, eventually I ended up in that very top category. So I eventually convinced my management that they'd been wrong for the first 3 years, which was very, very satisfying. Another challenge was while I was at AT&T, I got divorced, which was actually a really good thing. But that eventually produced a 5-body situation where I had me and my husband and my ex-husband and his wife and our daughter that we collectively had custody over. And my ex-husband decided he really wanted to live in California. We lived in New Jersey. So we actually figured out how all of us could move to California, and I worked remotely for AT&T for 6 years to make that happen, because it really mattered to me that my daughter had the experience of being with her dad and with me on a regular basis. So I was able to get a visiting position at Stanford and sit at Stanford, and so I was in an academic place where I could talk to good colleagues and work with students, and I wouldn't necessarily, well, it's hard to work remotely, but in this case for me, the trade-off worked out. So that's some of the backstory behind the CV that might look intimidating, right? So there are bumps along the way for everybody, and when you experience bumps, it's just your turn, and the goal is to meet them with as much resilience as possible. Okay, so academia is fantastic, and by academia, what I mean is research-focused position. So being at AT&T in a research lab, I would describe as being in academia, even though the teaching portion of academia in a research lab is focused on internships and is less substantial than the teaching part of being a professor. So I'd actually like to ask you guys a little bit, like, why do you're here, so you're potentially interested in a job in academia. Why do you think you might want to do that? What have you heard, or what do you imagine might be exciting about life in academia? Yes?
I really like mentoring students. That's an aspect of academia, but also doing independent work.
Mm-hmm. So really like working with students, really like doing independent work. Other comments? Yep?
More freedom of choosing the research topic.
Freedom of choosing the research topic. Like I like to say when I talk to students about deciding whether to work in academia or go into industry is that it's a lifestyle choice. Right? Academia will not pay as well as going to work in industry, but you have a lot more control over what you're doing. Other thoughts? Yes?
You get to learn new stuff.
You get to learn new stuff, right? You constantly get to learn new stuff, right? So a lot of people go into a PhD program because, like, I like school. I don't want to stop school. I want to keep learning, right? And the great thing about an academic job is it's not just that you get to keep learning while you're a PhD student. You get to keep learning, like, throughout. Like, as a professor, I'm constantly still learning new things. While I was at AT&T, I was still learning things. While I was at DARPA, I was still learning things. It's a whole job that's focused on learning throughout the lifetime of the career. Other comments? Good job. So, like, what is my answer to this question? So I get to work on really interesting problems of my own choice. So both things are important, that they're interesting, and I got to do the picking. I really hate other people telling me what to do, which I guess is like the bottom line is not having a boss tell me what to do. I really, really like being independent. Like, I'm willing to work super hard if I get to choose what I'm working on. If you tell me what to do, not so excited about working on it. I also get to work with really smart people, right? So I must admit, I really much prefer working with smart people than working with other kinds of people. And in academia, like, students are also really smart. They might not know as much, but the capacity is there, and so I really enjoy that. It's also, I get a chance to make a difference, right? The work that I did at AT&T, the work that I did at DARPA really changed how the company or how parts of the government do certain pieces of work, which is really exciting. As we said, I get to learn constantly. I get to do, another thing that is true about academia is you get to do tons of different things. Like, if you get sick of one particular kind of thing, you can take another thing off your task list and do something completely different, right? Each day I kind of marvel at, like, the whole different range of different kinds of things I get to do. I get to meet with students, I get to meet with PhD students, I get to read papers, I get to write papers, I get to give talks, and that's actually just a tiny portion of the things that I get to do on a regular basis. I also get to travel to really interesting places like Berlin. I've traveled all over the world. It is a little weird. You travel all over the world and you often see exactly the same people. Right? Like last year, I saw many of the same people in St. Louis, and I think maybe the year before that it was in Japan. But I find it like it's a nice way of kind of getting a gentle introduction to a place that I might not have been before, that I might then go back with my family or spend more time later. And then repeating, like, I really, really like not having a boss telling me what to do. So that's the glass is half full, but the glass is also half empty. Academia can be a really tough place. Any thoughts about, so I'd like to ask you guys your impressions so far. Maybe from Amal's talk you have some ideas about why academia is a tough place. Yes?
Limited positions.
Limited positions,
Politics,
meaning
the office politics.
the office politics. And you think that's worse than the office politics in not academia?
Possibly.
Possibly. There are differences. And one of the things about academia compared to industry is that academia has a lot more peer assessment, right? With like the tenure process, it's like your peers are writing their assessments. Your just a little bit above you colleagues are voting on your tenure case. And that creates different kinds of dynamics than in a more industrial setting. Yes, in the back?
As you said before, in the talk before, the advisor's job is to pick a topic that people care about. This is kind of contradictory to the thing that he does, the highlighting growth, meaning that you get to choose what to work on.
Right. There's definitely an art form to being strategic about picking something that's interesting to you that is also something that somebody else can care about, or picking something, or knowing that you're picking something that is high risk that other people might not care about. Yes?
You work really hard for your funding.
You sometimes have to work really hard for your funding. That kind of comes and goes in cycles. Sometimes the funding is falling, like right now if you're doing research in machine learning, the funding is like falling off of trees. Whereas if you're doing research in other areas, it can be hard to get funding. Yes?
It's easy to get sucked into this working in research and not having so much time for other work.
It can be easy to, the job can balloon to take over like all of your available cycles and make it so that you don't pay attention to or spend time in other parts of your life that you might also care a lot about. Yes?
If you get to choose everything that you work on, then you're choosing the things that you really care about. So if you care about something and then you try and publish and then somebody says like, this is really terrible, right? You get that reviewer do thing going on. Maybe it's not so good.
Indeed, it's getting papers rejected is quite a blow to the ego and is hugely demoralizing. And that's true whether you're a PhD student at the beginning of the process or senior faculty member, although the senior faculty member does by that point have more experience that, yeah, okay, the paper will be rejected, but it eventually will be accepted. Any researcher can tell you stories about papers that like, I can't believe, like I had a paper submitted to Popple a couple of years ago that got 5 reviews, 4 A's and 1 D. Paper got rejected. And the objection was we didn't do enough performance evaluation. And it's like, well, we didn't claim that the system was faster than other systems. We just claimed that it was fast enough to be usable. But no, we didn't compare it to these 2 other GLL and GLR parsing systems, so rejected. So then we submit to PLDI, and we had 3 reviews, none of whom knew anything about parsing, and rejected. Right? Eventually, we got it accepted at Uppsala. So persistence matters, and that's something that your advisor can really help you with. Is like, yeah, okay, the reviewer screwed up this time. Normally, they don't screw up twice in a row, but sometimes that happens, and you just perseverance. Other things about why academia is tough? So my answers to why academia is tough is you can always do more, right? You're working on research problems. They are open-ended. Teaching also turns out to be open-ended, and you can spend vast amounts of time teaching. So you can always do a better job. You can always do more. In some sense, it feels like it's never over. You're held to very, very high standards, right? Tenure says that you're the best in the world at X, which is a very daunting standard. Although one of the wiggle rooms there is you get to kind of define what X is, and you can make X kind of small. Right? You do have to persuade your university that the scope of your X is a reasonable scope for X, but still, that's a pretty daunting standard. You have many different roles. So one of the things I said about why I liked academia was because I got to do a ton of different things. But that also means that you have to do a ton of different things, right? So I'm a researcher. I write papers. I'm a reviewer, which means I have to read other people's papers and give my opinions about what I think about them. I'm an editor. I have to write. I'm a grant writer. I'm a teacher. I'm an advisor. I'm an administrator. I'm an organizer. I do all of these different things all the time, switching back and forth between them. So just the context switching and the time management can be really daunting. And related to this is that many, many different people can ask me to do stuff. Right? If you work in industry, typically you have one boss whose job is to make sure that what you're doing makes sense for the company. And that implies that they're not asking you to do 5 times as much as any one person can do. But as a academic, you have your department chair, you have the people that you're doing research with, you have the people who are funding your research, you have people outside in the community who ask you to serve on committees or ask you to give talks at mentoring workshops, for example. All those different people can ask you to do things, and they don't know about each other. So each one of them, like what they're asking you to do, completely reasonable. But the totality can be like ridiculously off the charts. So, you don't have a boss to serve as a gating function, and many, many different people can ask you to do stuff. So like one of the key tasks is that you yourself are responsible for managing your workload, and that can be daunting. Okay, so how do you do all that? So one of the key things to do is to be reflective about it, to not just randomly go forward and willy-nilly say yes and no to various things, but to actually think it through and have guiding principles. So that means actually sitting down and thinking about, what are my guiding principles? What do I care about? So for me, my guiding principles, I want to enjoy what I'm doing most of the time. I'm not willing to do a job where 75% of the time I'm doing stuff I don't want to do because maybe I get a huge paycheck, right? I don't want to go work for a Wall Street company where, fine, they're going to pay me a vast amount of money, but I am not enjoying what I'm doing most of the time. Like that, for me, that's just not where I want to be. I want to be enjoying what I'm doing maybe 90% of the time. Like not all the time. There are definitely things I have to do that I don't really like doing, but it's a relatively small fraction of my time. I care very much that my family, my social relationships are really good. So I have a really good relationship with my husband, with my daughter, with close friends, with family, my extended family. So that means I don't ignore them. I spend time with them, and I make sure that I make time to spend with them. I want to work on interesting and practically motivated programming language problems with smart people that I like. So the like part is really important. I don't care how smart you are. If I don't want to spend time hanging out with you, I'm not going to work with you. Like the benefit of, wow, I could like do some amazing stuff if I worked with this person that I can't stand, like not worth it. So see, like this one, I want to enjoy what I'm doing most of the time. So working with somebody that I don't like, not willing to do that. Programming language problems. Like when I went to AT&T, it might have been easier if I'd switched out of programming languages into something maybe like networking that AT&T is more obviously connected with. But like, no, I really want to work on programming language problems. And I personally care about working on practically motivated programming language problems. So problems that are of theoretical interest that may solve some long-standing problem, I'm less interested in that. I'm happy to have other people work on that. It's a very worthwhile thing to do. It's just not what makes me interested and happy. So this is like be successful as a researcher. And then this is like, I actually care that other people see that I'm successful as well. Right? So it's not just that I think I'm doing a good job. I care that other people think I'm doing a good job too. And part of that is just because it matters to me what other people think. But part of it is because that's a gating function for being able to change jobs or do other things in the future or get asked to do other things in the future because other people recognize that I'm doing a good job. This is a way of having job security. Like if you have tenure, job security is not an issue, but pre-tenure or in a research lab, your job security is really, can you get another job somewhere else? And so that requires other people to have a good opinion about what you're doing. And then I also personally really, really care about the vibrancy and the health of the community. So not just the quality of the research, but that there's support in place to help people, that the institutions are thriving. So for example, the mentoring workshops, right, I helped found the mentoring workshops so that people like you would be able to come and meet researchers and get told stories about what makes a successful career and what doesn't, and get help. So part of what I'm willing to do is spend time helping other people to build our community to a vibrant place. These are my principles. Your principles probably are completely different. So what's important is not that you follow my principles, it's that you figure out what your principles are and then use them to help guide your decisions. So then, use those guiding principles to actively manage your goals. So what do I want to accomplish? And that's what do I want to accomplish personally? What do I want to accomplish professionally? And in multiple timescales, kind of like, what do I want to accomplish this week while I'm here at ICFP? What do I want to accomplish in the next year? What do I want to accomplish in the next 5 years? Right? And spend a little bit of time, not like every day thinking about these, but periodically think about where am I and what do I want to accomplish? And then consciously monitor what you're actually doing. When you're asked to do something, think about it. Like, do I want to take this on? Why would I want to take this on? what would it, how would it help me satisfy my guiding principles? And making sure when I take something on that it's actually achievable, that I have the skills, I have the resources to be able to accomplish it, including the time to be able to do it. If it's something that's amazing, but there's no way I have the time to do it, then I either have to say no, or I have to redo the rest of my obligations so that I have the time to do a good job. And talk about them with my mentors. So no matter where you are in your professional career, having mentors is super important. So I have 3 or 4 mentors at the moment, and one of their key roles at the moment is playing the role of a no coach. So I get asked to do something, I'm excited, I will call them up and say I have this opportunity, what do you think? And sometimes they'll say yeah, that's a really great idea, it matches what you want to do, I think you should say yes. Or more often it's what are you thinking? Right? Remember, you want to have time to spend with your daughter, you want to finish this other thing, you should say no. It was really very helpful to have that perspective. So another thing that's important to realize is that demand comes in waves. It's not like this constant thing. It goes up and down. So it's fine that there are these high periods where maybe you spend less time with your family and you really focus on doing a particular thing, or it's a paper deadline, you don't do as much of your TAing responsibilities, or it's a TAing deadline, you don't do as much as your research deadline. That kind of shifting things around, totally normal, perfectly makes sense. The thing I think that's important to do is when you get these downtimes, is to actually let yourself relax. Right? Because you're your boss, it's really easy to just feel this constant sense of, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. It's really important to step back every once in a while, unplug, go away, do whatever makes you happy and relax, and really take a break. And it's a little bit counterintuitive and hard to trust this, but when you do that, you can come back and be vastly more productive and happier in the same time. And it's not like you you figure out, you come and you sit here and you learn about work-life balance, and then your entire life you have good work-life balance. It doesn't work like that, sorry. It's a constant monitoring thing that you just have to pay attention, and sometimes you overshoot and become way too busy, and then you need to take stock and okay, I need to gracefully get out of the situation, and then figure out how not to get in the situation, at least in the same way, again, in the future. You can also overshoot by saying not having enough, but I've never actually really seen that happen. It's much, much easier to overshoot than undershoot. So with time management, the reason why this is so important is because there's always more to do in an academic career. So when taking on a new task, you want to refer to your guiding principles. You want to really think about how much time is this going to take? And a good rule of thumb that Mike Hicks from the University of Maryland talks about is imagine that they were asking you to do this next month. Not 6 months from now, but very, very short time frame. Do you have enough time to do that? If the answer is oh my God, no, then you probably don't have time to do it in 6 months either. So that's a useful way of kind of imagining how much time something's going to take. And then when you're asked, right, it's much, 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 much worse to say yes and do a bad job than to say no. Almost all circumstances, you can actually say no. And if you say no promptly, that's really quite appreciated. So the best thing from the point of view of somebody asking you to do something is you say yes, you do a great job, everybody's happy. If you say yes and do a bad job, you've made their job much, much harder, and they will remember and they will be mad at you. And that will last. The research community is not that big, so you don't have that many people to burn by saying yes and doing a bad job. So just don't say yes and do a bad job. If you don't have time to do a good job, just say no. It's completely fine to say no. If you say yes and then you realize, oh no, I screwed up, I don't have time, go to that person and say okay, I said yes, turns out XYZW, I can't do what I promised to do. What can we do? How can we make this work going forward? And renegotiate the commitment. Basically give that person a heads up as soon as possible so that they can figure out how to rejigger the responsibility, find somebody else, stop doing the thing, whatever it is. But don't do the ostrich thing. Don't pretend that it's going to be fine. That will make somebody really, really annoyed. You say yes and then you just bail on them. Super annoying. Right. And this is a good thing too, is whenever you say yes, it's a good time to take stock of your overall portfolio and find thing to say no to and basically say, okay, I'm going to resign from that thing because now I have this new thing. Organizational skills, it's the more organized you are, the more you can do. And the more you can do, the more fun you can have, the more impact you can have, the more you will get asked to do. So one of the key things here is knowing when you work the most effectively and not squandering that time, right? So as I said, my daughter was born when I was a first-year PhD student. I had 8 hours of childcare a day. We had an au pair, so I could work from like 9 to 5. I would get into my office at like 9:15, and from 9:15 until 12, I was like the only person in my office. There were no other graduate students around. So during that time, I could be super productive. And because I had the limited time, I was very focused on getting my work done. As opposed to the other PhD students who came in at noon, they often then went and played ping pong, and then they played volleyball. And I actually graduated in less than the average amount of time because I was very focused and knew to make maximal use of the time that I had because I had a very limited amount of time. It's also super important to take care of yourself, right? So you periodically want to evaluate, like, am I actually happy? What about what I'm doing is making me happy? What is not making me happy? How can I shift what I'm doing to make myself more in the happy space than the not happy space? The second bullet is something that probably doesn't apply as you're a grad student, but after you're a grad student, even if you go into academia and you take the less well-paying job, it's still a very well-paying job. And it's a good idea to think about, like, unless you really like doing laundry or cleaning the house, is it better for you to do that work or for you to pay somebody else to do that work and use your time, which is actually an incredibly valuable resource, to do something else, like maybe go for a run or go watch a movie or do some research, right? Like it varies from person to person. Like maybe you really do like vacuuming. If so, vacuum, fine. Personally, I hate vacuuming. Pay somebody to vacuum every day. Any time I would pay somebody to vacuum. This one's also really important: exercise, eat well, get enough sleep. So particularly as department chair, where a lot of my job is dealing with crisis, I make sure that I get enough sleep on a regular basis. I'm in bed by 10, I get up at 6, so I have 8 hours of sleep a night. I also generally exercise about 42 minutes a day, usually watching a TV show, which is why it's 42 minutes, because that's how long hour-long TV shows really are in the US. So that sort of doubles as I get 42 minutes of mindless entertainment, watching some murder mystery series or science fiction series or whatever, and I get exercise. And also, eat well. This will make you much more happy and much more effective at anything that you're doing. So, like a mantra that I remember is, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Like, keep in mind, like you're in this for the long haul, not for the short haul. And it should be fun as you're going along, which of course isn't, in my opinion, true of a marathon, but your mileage may vary. Right, so just leave up the slide why I think academia is great, and then we have a few minutes for questions. So thank you for your time. Questions? Yes?
It seems awfully skewed towards academia, but you had a long career in industry as well. So what's great about industry? I think it falls there.
Yeah, so actually I said at the beginning that my definition of academia here is actually a research-focused position. So I would say that my career at AT&T, my career at DARPA, and my career at Tufts, I would classify all of them as academia. So I really probably should have said research-oriented career is great, but academia is a lot shorter than research-oriented career. A downside of companies with respect to academia is companies are a lot less stable. They change their mind a lot faster. So like when I went to AT&T, AT&T Labs, it's been an institution, it split off of Bell Labs right as I joined, but like Bell Labs had been an institution for 100 years, right? But like hugely stable fixture of American industry. Like what can be more stable than that? 2 years after I was there, they laid off 40% of the research staff, like 40% of the research staff. They had multiple waves of layoffs while I was there. So the principle of I want to be successful so that I can be hired somewhere else probably came out of being in that environment where like, the ground can get pulled out of you at any moment. So like when I went to AT&T, I'm like, oh, this is much more stable. I don't have to worry about this tenure stuff. Whereas after I was at AT&T, like, wow, tenure, like you get at least 6 years. That seemed way, way more stable than AT&T after I'd been there for a while. In academia, you have to be able to get grant funding to pay for your PhD students. In industry, you have to work on problems that are of interest to the company. So you kind of have one funding agent, which is your company. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both of those approaches, but that's a difference between academia and industry. More questions? Yes.
So you talked a lot about like ups and downs and things. What do you think would be like the single greatest accomplishment in your career that you're most proud of, and the time that you were maybe at your lowest?
Okay.
Hopefully they're not the same.
Right. I think maybe the accomplishment I'm most proud of is the work that I did at DARPA on the HACMS program, where I created the program. I got about $80 million of funding to hire about 100 researchers around the world to work on taking formal methods-based approaches and applying them to building software for a quadcopter and a helicopter that a red team could then try to break into. So the red team attacked each of the platforms at the beginning of the program and demonstrated that they could take over complete control of the systems with relatively low levels of effort. At the end of 16 months, they got the quadcopter back, which the blue team, the formal methods researchers, et cetera, had redone most of the software, and the red team had 6 weeks to replicate what they had done before. They had full access to all the source code. They participated in all the design decisions. They knew as much about the system as possible. They just couldn't have physical access to the device. They were not able to hack into the system. So my colleague at DARPA, who's a penetration testing expert, his estimate was that UAV was the most secure UAV on the entire planet. And then the DARPA at that point said basically they thought the entire program was going to be total failure, which is evidence that DARPA really does like to take risks, right? They spent $80 million on something they thought was going to totally fail. But in fact, after 16 months, it already totally succeeded as far as they were concerned. And then in the last 3 years of the program, researchers applied the same tools and techniques to Boeing's unmanned Little Bird. And they eventually allowed the red team to put their own code, whatever code they wanted, in one of the partitions on the quadcopter running in root access, not the quadcopter, the helicopter, and they allowed the red team to attack the helicopter to try to disrupt its operations while it was in flight with 2 test pilots, and they were not able to. So very compelling proof of formal methods being able to dramatically increase the security of a system. So there, like a DARPA program manager, I would argue, it's like when you're a grad student, you do your own work, right? You know where all the bits are buried. You know exactly what really works and where it kind of works. You graduate, you become a professor. Now your job is to look up a little bit more and see not just like the immediate problem, but kind of how it fits in the landscape. You write grant proposals, you hire grad students, you mentor them, you make sure they have the resources they need, you make sure that they are playing well with others and making good progress, and you do the research, but you're a little bit less close to those bits. Being a DARPA program manager is like one level up from that, right? Instead of writing grant proposal, you write meta grant proposal. Instead of hiring PhD students, you hire research groups, and you do the same thing. You make sure they have the resources they need, that they're playing well with others, that they're making good progress. You still know what's going on, but you're a little further removed, and you don't get your names on the papers. But I feel like I was still very much leading a research group. It was just a research group of 100 researchers around the world. My lowest point was probably getting those does not meet expectations reviews when I was at AT&T. I felt super frustrated that like I had identified that my area of research was not a good match for AT&T, and I was moving as fast as I could to be relevant to AT&T. And you had to submit, like your Form 1 was kind of colloquial called Why I'm Great every year as part of the evaluation process. And then 3 months later, they would tell you why you're not. Right? They would give you their feedback. And each time the performance, that 3-month thing would come back, and they would say, you really should have done X, Y, and Z. Like I would have done I did X, Y, and Z in that 3-month period. And it was just like, would you guys give me some credit here? So that was really, and right around that time was layoff. So it was very demoralizing, very stressful period. More questions? Yes.
So you had mentioned one non-academic route that you see people take, which I guess is working on Wall Street. What are other non-academic, in your definition of academia, tracks that people take?
Oh, so my husband works at Google. He did his PhD at MIT, but he really decided he hated having tons of different kinds of things to do. He really wanted to work on like one thing, and he wanted that one thing to be something that touched millions, hundreds of millions of people. So he worked on the Bigtable, so the data store that stores a lot of Google's data, and then now he works on image search. So the software that he works on, everyone in the room has probably run his code or asked Google to run his code on their behalf. So that's one path. Startups are another path.
working at a place like Galois is kind of in between, where some of what you're doing is more industry related, but you're still doing it in the context of being at the very forefront. You may or may not publish, so you may or may not be kind of working on the research side, but you're very, very close to the research side. So that's a place where you're kind of straddling the two, and there are a bunch of places like Galois that do that kind of straddling. So those are some of the possibilities. So I spoke at the mentoring workshop at PLDI, and there the talk I gave about was all the different kinds of things you could do with a PhD. I chose not to give that talk here because it's kind of a US-centric talk, but in Europe and in Asia and in the US, there's tons of different kinds of jobs that you can do with a PhD. So just keeping your eyes open for the variety of things, you'll see them.
And follow on from that, our panel this afternoon, we have put on it lots of people from both academic and industry, and some people have done the full everything now. So lots of chance then to ask questions on what's it like in industry versus, and they don't just mean research labs, I mean software engineer, research scientist, everything. So you'll get lots of chances to ask.
Cool. Do we have time for another question, or should we stop?
One more, there's another quick one. If not, I guess it's time for lunch.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of PLNW.